Our keynote speaker for this session is AppRev. AppRev delivers technology-enabled revenue cycle optimization services in a SaaS model. Products include pricing analytics, charge accuracy, denials intelligence, and pricing transparency, and they're serving more than 120 clients throughout the US. Thank you, AppRev, for your ongoing support of the Oregon chapter. This session is Leadership, the Art of Inspiring People at Their Best. Our guest speaker is Greg Whelden. He's a Major General, U.S. Army, retired Global Fortune 500 speaker. So a little bit about Craig is his leadership journey began as an Eagle Scout at the age of 14. 30 years later, he was the youngest general in the United States Army. Combined with another 9 years as a member of a senior executive services with the U.S. Marine Corps, he's led thousands of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians while serving 10 years of Europe and another 12 in the Pacific. In 2011, he was inducted into the Peru University Tri-Service ROTC Hall of Fame. In March of 2019, he would publish The Leadership, the Art of Inspiring People at Their Best, winning 3 book awards and obtaining #1 international bestseller status of Amazon. Craig's now a Global Fortune 500 speaker, and lives in Bluffton, South Carolina. Welcome, Craig. Oops, you are on mute right now.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Thanks so much, Tammy, for that introduction. Is the time mine now?
The time is yours.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, everybody, for inviting me to participate with you today. I want to, first of all, give a thanks to all of you for what you do for the healthcare industry. As you all know, the frontline workers, doctors and nurses and first responders of all types became America's new heroes over the past year. And I have come to believe over the many years I served in the military that it takes a complete, total team to deliver that kind of service. And many of you work back office jobs that you don't get the kind of exposure that doctors and nurses do, but you can't do what they do without everybody participating. So thanks again for the contribution that you give. I'm going to share some slides here. So let me get this up on the screen, make sure it's showing okay. Can you see that? Somebody tell me yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so let me get the first slide up. So I'm a storyteller. You'll find in my book that I tell lots and lots of stories because I think it's one of the best forms of communication. And if you're trying to make a point to somebody, either talking to them or writing to them, tell a story and make your point that way. So I tell lots of stories when I'm on stage. I tell lots of stories, and I'm going to tell a lot of stories today. Some of them have very, very clear takeaways on leadership and life lessons. Others have a lesson that is a little bit more subtle, and some of them have no lesson whatsoever. They're just good stories. So I ask you today to take what you want, leave what you don't want, and pass on to others whatever you deem is worthy. If you have taken the Myers-Briggs personality test, I'd ask you to type into the chat room your 4-letter profile. For example, I'm an ISTJ. I am an ISTJ. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But if you are an EFMP or whatever your profile is, and you've taken the test and you know what it is, please type it in the chat room. We'll talk about that just a little bit later. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about my family. And some of you may say, why is he telling us where he lived and where he's been and about his family? And I think as I talk about that, you will see how it comes together a little bit later, because where I lived and the family members that I have and the things that occurred with them over time impacted the decisions I made in my life, both professionally and personally. So let me start back in 1983 at the Hale Koa Hotel in Waikiki, Hawaii, in Honolulu. What you see is a picture of Waikiki. Inside the red box is Fort Tarusi. Fort Tarusi is a military installation that's right in the heart of Waikiki. It's a recreational site for military members. And the Hale Koa Hotel, which is at the end of the arrow, is an Army-run hotel for active duty service members and their family members and retirees. It was established during the Vietnam War to provide rest and recreation opportunities for soldiers coming back halfway through their tour to meet their family in Hawaii for a week or two of vacation. We were in the Hale Koa Hotel, my wife and I, in 1983, on the top apartment room that faces the ocean. And when we were standing out looking at the ocean and the backdrop of Honolulu and so forth, I took this photograph. Notice the 1980s hairdo. That is my wife in 1983. And when I put my camera down, she said to me, "This is where I want to live." And I said, "Karen, I'm a tanker. They don't have any tanks in Hawaii. The Army will never send me to Hawaii." So this is 35 years later, just so you can see the evolution. The hair is a little bit different color, but she's just as wonderful now as she was back then. And that's the finest little grandson on the planet. He's now 5 years old. So again, she said, I said, "I will never get assigned to Hawaii because they don't have tanks into Hawaii." And then in the year 2000, which was about 17 years later, I became the deputy commander of U.S. Army Pacific, and we moved from the Pentagon to Hawaii, and I had 3 wonderful years there. This is the house I lived in on Palm Circle at Fort Shafter. We lived there 2000 to 2003. It was an old historic house on Palm Circle. If any of you have seen the movie Pearl Harbor, Palm Circle, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner, was in that movie in 5 scenes. And one of those scenes had my house in the movie. So it's really a wonderful place to live. And I tell people that if you go to the Honolulu airport, you will see my wife's fingernail marks on the tarmac as we drug her on the airplane when we left there in 2003 in retirement. We'll talk a little bit about why we left there and why we left in 2003 a little bit later. So we moved from Hawaii to Celebration, Florida, and we spent 7 years there. This is the town that Disney built. Some of you may know about it. It's on Disney World property. You could hear the fireworks from Epcot from inside our home. We were that close to Epcot and the other places in Disney. And we spent 7 years there, and they were wonderful years. 5 years into that, I walked by my wife one day, and she was on the internet looking at property in Hawaii. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I am interested in going back to Hawaii." And I said, "Hawaii is really expensive. I'd have to get a job." And she said, "That's a good idea." So I started looking for opportunities to get back to Hawaii. And in 2010, the Marine Corps created a position called Marine Corps, the Executive Director, Marine Corps Forces Pacific, focused on moving Marines from Okinawa to Guam and building a base there. I applied, threw my name in the hat, was selected, and I spent another 9 years in Hawaii, and they were wonderful years. We lived on the windward side in a place called the Treehouse. This is the view of Kaneohe Bay. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner from Lanai, and it was wonderful. It truly was. But about 3 years ago, my wife said to me, "I'm ready to move back to the mainland." And after I picked myself up off the floor, because I thought we were there to stay, I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because we're too far from family. We need to be closer." And so in 2019, we moved back to South Carolina. And what you see in the cluster in the right-hand side on the eastern coast is essentially where our family is located. The bottom one in Florida is my daughter, and the one of the ones in North Carolina is one of the nephews that is very close to me. So just before we left, somebody asked me, "What are you going to do next? What is it that you want to do in the next chapter of your life?" And I said, "I want to give back what I've learned to the next generation." And they said, "Well, you need a book." And I said, "Good grief, a book? I'm 67 years old. I can't write a book." I had written some articles in my time, and I thought I was a pretty fair writer, but a book was very intimidating. But make a long story short, I did write a book. It won 3 national book awards. It's become a international bestseller in 5 countries. This is a copy of it. You can see find it easily on Amazon. And for most of the groups that I talk to live, they purchase a copy of my book for everybody in attendance. I dedicated my book to my dad because the first chapter in the book is all about character, and my dad taught me all about character. This is a photograph of him that you'll find in the front pages of the book, and the coin that you see on the right-hand side is a coin that was given to him by Chiang Kai-shek in 1945 when he turned over his airplane to the Chinese Nationalist Army and came home to start the next chapter in his life. And that coin is a very special memento to me. My father died in 2003, and my mother died just about 2 months ago. So I have memories of both of them, which are very fond, as I'm sure you do all with your family. So let's talk about my journey. You heard in the introduction that my leadership journey began when I became an Eagle Scout at age 14. For me, that was the climb of a mountain, and it was about the journey and getting to the top of the mountain. And I naively really didn't understand in the years preceding attaining Eagle Scout that there were expectations when I became an Eagle Scout that I didn't fully understand and didn't appreciate to become a leader. And when I became an Eagle Scout, they said, okay, now you're a leader, you need to lead. And I thought, you know, this was all about, for me, getting this little eagle on my chest. And so it was a little bit of cold water on my face. And I started to learn the hard way what leaders need to do to be effective. And that carried through high school and sports and student government and into college, and then 30 years in the Army, and then another 9 years with the Marine Corps. And so, you know, over the course of my journey, this is a photograph of me in about 2003 when I was a 2-star general and the deputy commander of U.S. Army Pacific. So we're going to jump around and tell stories that are unrelated to the previous slide. In this next one is a little bit about that. What you see in the photograph, and some of you know this story, I'm sure, because it was all over the news. The fellow on the left is Spanish, and his name is Ivan Anaya. And the fellow on the right is Abel Mutai. He's from Kenya. Just before crossing the finish line in an international cross-country race a few years ago, Abel, who was from Kenya, became confused with the signage and stopped running, thinking that he had won. Ivan, who's on the left from Spain, was behind him, and realizing what was happening, shouted to him to keep running. Of course, Matai did not speak Spanish, so he didn't understand what he was saying. So Anaya then ran up, because now at this point, Abel was walking, and Ivan ran up to him, caught up to him, and pointed the way to the finish line, encouraging him to continue running. After the race, a reporter asked Ivan why he let him win, and he replied, "I didn't let him win. He was going to win." And the reporter then said, "But you could have won." And Ivan said, "Well, what would my victory been worth then? And what would my mom think?" So later, years later, one of the reporter, in discussing this particular incident, asked Ivan about it. And as he reflected back on it, he said, "Try to remember for the kind of person you were, not for the titles or professional achievements." So the point of this slide is that character counts. And what you have in this photograph is a strong expression of well-founded character, which obviously was instilled by his mom, because of the comment he made about his mom would have been very disappointed if he would have taken advantage of that situation. So let's talk about a little bit about what we have in common and why that's important. When you're communicating to somebody else, and it doesn't matter whether it's an individual or a group, it's important for you to understand who that person is and how you must communicate your message, because you want to connect to them in terms that they understand. You want to make sure that whatever it is that you're saying is understood by the other party. Again, whether it's a group or whether it's individual. And so let me give you a simple medical example. Here is a doctor talking to somebody about their father who has got a problem. And I'm sure that many of you know exactly what this means, but I didn't the first time I read it, and I still have trouble with it. So imagine a doctor saying, Before we extubate your father, we're going to optimize his hemodynamics with beta blockade and afterload reduction. Then we'll perform a therapeutic bronchoscopy to clear secretions in order to maximize success. Most people won't understand what that means, and I'm one of them, and some of you may be in that same category. You'll find the same challenge when you're talking to somebody has an IT background, somebody who has a legal background. Oftentimes they talk in terms that they understand, but perhaps the receiving party does not understand. So here's a way to say the same thing a little bit differently. We want to safely remove the breathing tube from your father and allow him to breathe by himself. But before we do that, so that we don't have to put it back in, we plan to reduce his heart rate and blood pressure with medication. Then we will take an instrument called a bronchoscope, which is a long tube with a light on the end, and look into his airways to suck the mucus out so that he can breathe easier when the tube comes out. That is bedside manner. That is talking to somebody in terms that most people would understand. And the doctor that talks in the yellow box is going to be much better understood by the average person than in the tan box at the top. So effective communications is critically important. If you're talking to a 6-year-old or a 60-year-old, a liberal or a conservative, a male or a female, an American or a foreigner, it almost doesn't matter what you're saying as long as you communicate to them the same message in terms that they understand. You will achieve success. The other point I would say about effective communications, if you read the body language of the person you're talking to, and you can tell that they're just waiting for you to take a breath so that they can start talking, then they're not hearing you very well. They're not listening very effectively. And you might want to take a pause and let them get off their chest, whatever it is they need to get off their chest, so you can pick up again. So as you're communicating your message, again, to a group or to an individual, read the body language of the audience, determine whether or not you're connecting. It becomes pretty obvious when you're not. I have a video that I typically show when I'm with a live audience, but I've tried this a couple of times online like I am today, and the streaming capability has some challenges, so I'm not going to show that today, but I would encourage all of you, this is a very short but interesting and funny video, talks with two people who are having a difficulty communicating with each other. And it's called It's Not About the Nail. If you go to Google and you type in It's Not About the Nail, it'll pop right up. It takes 4 or 5 minutes to watch, and I think it'll make the point pretty effectively. So Dr. Frank Luntz once said, it's not what you say that matters, it's what people hear. And I couldn't agree more. It's really what people hear, not what you say. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. When I was a company commander many, many years ago, I had about 100 soldiers in my command, and I saw each and every one of them every single day. I got to know them very, very well. So it didn't take me writing down what we will call my philosophy of command or my vision statement for my organization when you've only got about 100 people reporting to you, because they knew me very, very well. When I became a battalion commander a few years later, I had 1,000 soldiers in my organization. And because the military moves people every 2 or 3 years, they were constantly coming in and out of the organization. So I determined, and most people do in the military, at this point in your career, when you're a commander, essentially the CEO of the organization, that you write a philosophy of command, because that then gives the organization a direction. It tells them what your values are. It tells them what your non-negotiables are, and it tells them more about you. And oftentimes new commanders coming into an organization would write their philosophy of command ahead of time and issue it on the very first day they arrive. So there's no question as late as the second day how the new commander thinks. That's what I did. Now, this was in 1989, as you can see. I sat down in the spring of 1989 and I wrote this out on a legal pad. And after I got done and I was comfortable with it, I typed it up and I made about 15 copies. And then I sent it to people that I trusted, people who had worked for me, people I had worked for, and people who had worked with me. And I said, this is, I think, a good description of my philosophy of command. I would ask for your very, very candid feedback. And am I telling it like it is, or am I being naive? And I got some good feedback from those people that I trusted, and I made a few tweaks to the philosophy of command based on that input. And then I issued this on the very first day of my command. I had a meeting with all my senior leaders, and I described for them the way I thought. Let me read what's in blue. As I joined the 2nd Battalion, 10th Cavalry, I owe it to each of you to describe in some detail my philosophy of command. If you understand the thrust of this memo, you will understand me. That was essentially the first paragraph of my philosophy of command. It stretched about 6 or 7 pages. And every month when we got newcomers coming into the battalion, I would hold a meeting of all the newcomers. I would issue a copy of my philosophy of command, and I would talk to them about it. So everybody coming into the organization knew exactly the direction we were headed, what I thought was important, what was non-negotiable, and more about me. Now, philosophies of command are similar to a corporate vision statement or something that a CEO or a managing director that's got a large organization and lots of people underneath them. So it's very applicable in the civilian world. You will find this in Appendix A of my book. I've got the entire philosophy of command there if you're interested in reading the whole thing as a kind of a reference. And it's in a little bit of military speak, but at the time when I wrote it, I was writing it in terms that my audience would understand because they were all soldiers in my battalion. Here's another kind of philosophy of command. Here's one that you could put on a 3x5 card. When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion, Abraham Lincoln. And that's, when you peel that onion back a little bit, it's pretty easy to understand how he thought. So it can be 6 or 7 pages. It can be on a 3x5 card, or it can be anything in between. But it's important for the people in your organization to know what you think is important, what is less consequential, what is non-negotiable in the direction that you want to go. I also developed a briefing called Whelden on Whelden, and that happens to be in my book as well. It's Appendix B. And that was a little more focus on me as a person, my personality, things that I had personal quirks about, and so forth, and my strengths and weaknesses. And I think effective leaders and confident leaders can tell people what their weaknesses are. I have weaknesses that I know, and I always told my organization, look, these are weak spots that I want to tell you about ahead of time that I recognize and I'm working on. Let's talk about change management a little bit. Here is a saying that I think is interesting. We had trained well, but it seemed that every time we were beginning to form up into teams, we reorganized. I was to learn later in life that we tend to meet any new situation by reorganizing. And what a wonderful method it can be for creating the illusion of progress while producing confusion, inefficiency, and demoralizing the troops. So you might say to yourself, yeah, I relate to that. Somebody comes in, brand new director, brand new CEO, brand new manager, and they start changing things right away. And it's frustrating because it sends a signal to the organization that he obviously or she obviously thinks that we're broken. So in the military, typically, unless you have a mandate to go in and change something when you take over, people don't do that. They go in, and at the change of command ceremony, we always have a ceremony to officially pass the flag to the new commander symbolically and read the orders of the new commander. We typically say, the incoming commander will say, all current policies and procedures will remain in effect for now. And then we take 60 to 90 days to do our own assessment as we're part of the organization before rearranging the deck chairs on what may not be the Titanic. So who said this? This was attributed to Petronius Arbiter, who was a Roman general in 66 AD. So you can see that leadership really hasn't changed very much in 2,000 years. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the, I don't know if anybody put in the chat room. I'm looking down at the bottom. I don't seem to have access to the chat room. So Oh, here we go, chat. Let me pull that up. All right, so several of you have let's see, Amanda's an ESTJ, Iwona is an INFP, Wendy is an ENFJ, Meredith, INTJ. Samantha kind of goes back and forth between INTJ and ISTJ. That's fair. You can take this test several times, and I think Sarah's the same way. And then Doreen is an INTJ. So some of you have taken the Myers-Briggs test. For those of you who have not, it is a personality test that you can find online. You can take it in about 30 to 40 minutes. It's easy, and it will assign 4 letters to you like you've seen. Nobody who responded in the chat room is an ISTJ, but some of them are close. A couple of you were INTJ. What ISTJ stands for is introverted, sensing, thinking, and judgmental. And each of these letters has an opposite. For example, I is introvert, E is extrovert. That's a simple example of the opposites. And so I am an introvert. I recognize that I'm an introvert. I recognize that there are strengths and there are weaknesses to being an introvert. And because I recognize that, I lean on people in my organization who are extroverts to help me with my introversion. So what is an ISTJ? Simply put, it is somebody who is serious, quiet, earns success by concentration and thoroughness. Practical, orderly, matter-of-fact, logical, realistic, and dependable. Takes responsibility. Makes up his own mind as to what should be accomplished and works toward it steadily, regardless of protest or distraction. And after I took the test, and I've taken it 4 or 5 times over the course of about 40 years, I always come out as an ISTJ. And as I read through this description, that's how I see myself. And if you ask my wife, that's how she sees me as well. She's not an ISTJ. She's kind of the opposite of that. And so she brings certain strengths to our relationship that I don't have. And I bring certain strengths like the organizational skills that most ISTJs have to the relationship as well. So if you take this concept of understanding what your personality is like and translate it or transpose it into your organization, I think there's value in understanding the people, certainly the first line leaders in your organization, what kind of personality they have. Because if you are the leader of all of them, you want to draw on the strengths of everybody and you want to minimize the weaknesses of everybody as well. And having an appreciation for what everybody is in the organization will assist you in doing that. This is kind of a funny prayer, the ISTJ prayer, because we are so organized and we keep lists and we're on time and all that sort of thing. The prayer is, God, help me begin relaxing about the little details tomorrow at 11:41 and 32 seconds. Let me tell you another story from Harvard Business Review that I read many years ago, a little over 20 years ago. You can find this online as well in the November-December 1999 edition of the Harvard Business Review. Some of you may know it already. It's called Who's Got the Monkey? And I'll tell you the story very quickly. There's a supervisor, a leader, who's sitting in his office, and let's say that he's an ISTJ like me. And he's very organized, and he keeps lists, and he checks them off as he does them. At the end of the day, he looks at his list, transposes what needs to happen tomorrow, puts the list down, sharpens all his pencils, puts them lined up on his desk, makes sure that his inbox is empty, gets up and leaves. So on Wednesday, one of the subordinates walks into his office and he says, "Hey boss, you know that project, we'll call it A. You remember Project A that you gave me a couple of weeks ago? I'm really struggling with that and I could use your help." Well, our leader is very busy because he's working his schedule and he's working all these projects. So he says to the subordinate, "Yeah, okay, put it in my inbox. I'll take a look at it and I'll give you some feedback a little bit later." So the subordinate drops it in his inbox, turns around and leaves. The next day, two more people walk in, Thursday, and they essentially repeat what just occurred on Wednesday. And he says the same thing, "Put them in my inbox, I'll take a look and I'll get back to you." And then on Friday, a fourth person does exactly the same thing. So now our leader at the end of the week has 4 items in his inbox that he didn't have at the beginning of the week. and it wasn't part of his list. It's an additional burden on him. So he says to himself, I want to start off next week with a clean slate. So I'm going to go home, have a good meal, get a good night's rest, and come back tomorrow morning on Saturday, and I'll take a look at these 4 items so that I can get them knocked out, and I'll start where I had intended to start on Monday. So he does. He goes home. The next morning he gets up, he gets in his car, he starts driving to work, and he drives by a golf course when he goes to work. And as he goes by the golf course, he glances over to the right. Who does he see on the first tee box but the 4 individuals that came into his office that day and dropped their problem back into his inbox, which he now is going into the office on a Saturday to solve. So what's the moral of this story? The moral of the story is, don't take the monkey off your back and put it on mine. Keep it on there. He could have handled that a little bit differently when they came into his office, so that they didn't leave with the monkey taken off of their back and put on his back. I write about that in my book and some techniques on how to do that. And one of them is to make sure everybody understands there's a process when I give you a project of analysis, of course of action development, of course of action comparison, and recommendation. That's the process I want you to go through each time I give you something to do, so that when you walk into my office, don't just give it back to me. Tell me about your analysis. Tell me about your courses of action, all of which need to be feasible, by the way. Tell me which one you recommend and why, and then we'll take it from there. But don't take the monkey off your back and put it on mine. There's a professor, and he's sitting at the front of the room. He teaches a graduate course in leadership. And everybody knows that they're going to get a pop quiz when they come in on Wednesday for that session. So everybody comes into the room, and they don't really know what the pop quiz is going to be. And the professor says to them, "What's the name of the janitor who cleans this room?" It's the only question on the test. And nobody knows the answer, and everybody fails the test. Now, the janitor happens to be available out in the hallway, around the school area, every time this class meets. And everybody in the organization sees the janitor. Some of them may even say hello to the janitor, but nobody took the time to even ask him what his name was. So nobody really knows the janitor. The janitor contributes to the total effort of their learning experience by making sure that the room is ready when they show up. But nobody took care to do that. And I learned this lesson many times early in my career, that everybody in the organization has a role to play in the success of the overall organization. And it gets back to the very first thing I said today when I talked about the healthcare industry and the role that you play in making sure that first line responders can do their job effectively. Make sure that you take care of everybody in your organization, and you'll have a much, much better organization. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a story that I tell a little bit later. Let me talk a little bit about mentorship. I have a chapter in my book on mentorship, and I say, and this is just me, I mean, other people have other thoughts, but I think there are really 4 kinds of mentorship. Assigned. Assigned means, hey, John, I'm assigning you to be Lisa's mentor. Self-appointed. John decides to be Lisa's mentor. Sought. Lisa seeks out John to be her mentor. And what I call virtual. Now, what is virtual? Virtual is a little bit different because it isn't attributable to any one individual. Imagine, if you will, you are going on a walk down a path of life in your profession or even in your personal life. And along the path, you see rocks. Each one of those rocks represent an experience that you have. Some of those are positive, some of those are negative. I'm sure many of you have said early on in your career when you were younger that as you observed a senior person in the organization do something that really, really impressed you, you may have said in your mind, wow, if I ever get into a position like that, I hope I'm like that. I want to remember that. You probably also have had experiences where you've seen a senior person do something where you might have said, wow, if I ever get into a position like that, I hope I am never like that. What I tell people is take both of those rocks and put them in your rucksack and carry them with you and remember them so that you repeat the things that you have experienced that are positive and you don't repeat the things you have experienced that are not positive. And I've got lots and rocks in my rucksack. This has been the most beneficial form of mentorship over my 40 plus years in association with the military. And the people that I learned from, both good and bad, didn't even realize that they were mentoring me at the time, but in fact they were. Memento Mori is a Latin term. And the story, as the story goes, a slave was standing behind a general on the chariot as they came back from a military victory. And he was tasked to remind the general that though he was at his peak today, as everybody was telling him how wonderful he was, tomorrow he could fail. This is all about humility. Humility is all a component of character. And I have seen too many senior people in the military and other places, but my experience mostly is in the military, that when they become senior, they forget their roots. They forget that they at one time were junior, like a lieutenant or a private in the military might be. And the problem is, if you don't treat everybody in the organization like the janitor that I spoke of earlier, with dignity and respect, those people will probably go find something else to do. And for the military, at the end of their commitment, they will leave the military and join the private sector because of the way they were treated. And you may drive people out of your organization because you don't treat them right, and they could have been very, very capable senior people in your organization. So again, in my military journey, anytime that I talk to a young officer or a young enlisted person, I had this frame of reference, this frame of mind. This person could 30 years from now be the chief of staff of the Army if it was an officer, or this person 30 years from now or 35 years from now could be the sergeant major of the Army. I want to make sure that they appreciate this organization and they want to come to work every day. They don't regret coming to work every day. So Memento Mori means remember you are mortal. And it's an issue related to humility. When I applied to be the executive director of Marine Corps Forces Pacific, I had an interview with a three-person panel, 2 generals and a member of the senior executive service. And the interview was about 30 to 35 minutes long. And at the very end, somebody asked me this question. If you had just 30 seconds in an elevator with a hiring official to convince him that you're the right person for the job, what would you say? And I thought for a moment and I said to myself, you know, I don't think I would tell them about my professional credentials or my experience, because I would have assumed that he read my resume, my application, and that he knew what they were. And quite frankly, that's hard to do in just 30 seconds anyway. So here's what I would tell him. I would tell him that you can talk to anybody who knows Craig Whelden, anybody who I have worked for, anybody I have worked with, or anybody who has worked with for me, and they will all say the same thing about me. Now, why did I say that? I said that because I wanted to make sure they understood that I was very confident they wouldn't find anybody that told them that I was two-faced, that I was bipolar, that I treated subordinates one way and seniors the other way. Now, reflect all of you on your experience in your professional life, and you may very well have worked for somebody who was Jekyll and Hyde. They were Jekyll to subordinates and Hyde, and I can't remember which is which, but they were one way with subordinates and they were a different way with their own bosses. And it drove me crazy because the bosses didn't understand the way that leader was treating his or her subordinates. And that is maddening. And I always tried to get through that to make sure anybody I brought in my organization understood, you know, you treat everybody in the organization with equal dignity and respect. In 1984, I was a student at Command and General Staff College, which is a mid-grade officer training for 1 year. It's an excellent course, and all majors in the Army go to that, and some other services, and even a few civilians. There were about 800 of us in the course. I had been in the Army about 10 years at that time. And at the end of the course, in the spring, the chief of staff of the Army, the very senior guy in the Army, a 4-star general, would come out, speak to the class, and at the end, he took questions and answers. And at the end of the presentation he gave, he said, "I'm happy to take any questions you may have." And a major raised his hand and he said, "Sir, can you define success in today's Army? Is it 20 years so I can make it to retirement? Is it making lieutenant colonel? Is it battalion command? Can you tell us what is success in today's Army?" And General Meyer thought for a moment. And he said, "Most of you probably think that I've been very successful." And we all thought, duh, of course you've been successful. And he said, "I'm a 4-star general. I'm the senior guy in the Army, but I can assure you there are another 10 or 11 4-star generals in the Army who report to me who, if they were in my position as the chief of staff of the Army and they retired from that position, they would be disappointed." And we all thought, how in the world could that be? And he said, because a career in the military, quite frankly, a career in the corporate world, or maybe even a journey through life, is like climbing a ladder. When you start off in the military, if you're an officer, you're standing on the ground and you reach out and you grab that first rung on the ladder. And for the military, that's second lieutenant. And then you reach up and grab the next rung on the ladder, and that's first lieutenant. Your feet are still on the ground. It's not very difficult. In fact, you can put both hands on both rungs of the ladder and you're not tired or anything else. But as you continue to climb that ladder and advance in your career, it gets more difficult. It gets more difficult because it's more competitive. And the rungs, metaphorically speaking, become further apart. You become tired because you're climbing. The air gets thinner because you're gaining altitude. And at some point, you're going to be standing on a ladder and you're going to have to take some risk to get to the next rung. You may have to even jump off of the rung you're standing on to reach the next rung. But what I'm telling you all today is that every one of you has a last rung on the ladder. And for 99% of you, it's not going to be at the top of the ladder. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. So as you climb this ladder coming out of this school, and you look at the next 10, 15, or 20 years that you might have in the military, set reasonable goals. But when you get to those goals, be satisfied. Don't be bitter and disappointed if you can't get to the next one, because everybody has a last rung on their ladder. And I thought at the time, that's pretty good advice. What should I strive to achieve? I think I want to be a battalion commander. Now, what did it take for me to be a battalion commander? It took 2 more rungs on the ladder. I had to get promoted to lieutenant colonel, and I had to come out on a command list, which is a very short list of all the lieutenant colonels in the Army. And that happened about 5 years later, and I became a battalion commander. And it was the best job I had in my 30 years in the Army. And there were some things that occurred in my career after that, positive. I got to more rungs on the ladder. I got promotions, I got command and so forth, and I retired as a 2-star general. But after I left battalion command, I said to myself, I have achieved the last rung on the ladder that I strove to achieve, and I need to be satisfied, because everything after this is icing on the cake. So I have spoken to a number of colonels, both in the Army and the Marine Corps, who didn't become generals. And as they were leaving the service, they were disappointed and they were bitter, because it was like just out of reach for them and they couldn't quite get there. But they, in their minds, they were so very close. And what I told them was, look, you've had a hugely successful career. Don't be disappointed. Find another ladder to climb. That's what I did. When I left the Marine Corps a year and a half ago, I started at the bottom of a new ladder called author and speaker. And I'm not very high on that ladder now, but I'm climbing in it and I'm happy to be on the ladder. Find another ladder to climb if you've reached the top of your ladder. So I wrote a chapter in my book about that. It's called How Tall Is Your Ladder? And when I got done with that, I thought, somebody's going to read this. Cynics will read this chapter and they will say, Whelden is telling us all to strive for mediocrity and not strive to be the best we possibly can. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying you should strive to be the best you possibly can. But if you can't get to the next rung on your ladder, Don't be disappointed and bitter. Be satisfied. And if you are not satisfied, then get off that ladder and find another ladder to climb, just like I did a year and a half ago. But after I wrote that chapter in the book, I said, I'm going to have to address this issue with the cynics. So I added another chapter, and it's called The 1% Advantage. All of you know that there is a 1% advantage. So if you think of any industry, think of the entertainment industry, the music industry with Grammys, that's the 1%. Think of the movie industry with the Oscars, that's the 1%. Think of the Olympic athletes and those that reach gold medal, that's the 1%. Football players, college football players who want to be professionals, that's the 1%. There are people who can strive to and do achieve the 1% advantage. And they are so much further along in whatever it is they strove to do than the rest of us. And that's fine. And the world needs that. Steve Jobs is an example of that. What's his name that runs the Tesla organization? Another example of that. The world certainly needs people like that. But everybody needs to recognize that for the rest of us mere mortals, that comes with some significant risks. And it comes with risk even if you're not a mere mortal. I encourage each one of you to go find on HBO, if you get HBO, or perhaps on the internet, a documentary called The Weight of Gold by Michael Phelps. And most of you know that Michael Phelps won more gold medals in the Olympics than any Olympic athlete in history. Now, Michael Phelps produced and starred in this documentary called The Weight of Gold to talk about essentially the, metaphorically speaking, weight of gold, because it comes with a huge sacrifice. When Michael Phelps finished his Olympic career, he looked in the mirror and the only thing he saw was a swimmer. And swimming was over. And he was in his late 20s and he thought, what am I going to do the rest of my life? And Michael Phelps will tell you in the documentary that at one time he contemplated suicide. There are other Olympic athletes who committed suicide. There are many people in the entertainment industry and in very difficult professions who have committed suicide at an early age in their life because they feel like their life is over. There are risks associated with the 1% advantage. And the only thing I tell people is recognize those risks when you strive to achieve the next rung on your ladder, because oftentimes it does come with risks. I have a good friend who went to West Point, which is the military academy that produces Army officers. And it's a very elite school. It's very, very difficult to get into. It's very hard to graduate from. They have reunions every year, and people go back, and it's very popular. They go back to meet with their classmates. And my friend went back to a reunion a couple of years ago, and he saw across the room, he was a retired colonel, which is a very successful achievement in the military. And he saw one of his classmates from West Point sitting on the other side of the room. And he had his back turned to him, and he was by himself. We'll call him John. So he went over to John, he tapped him on the shoulder, and he said, "Hey, John, how you doing?" And when John turned and looked at him, his eyes were watery. And my friend didn't know whether he'd had too much to drink or something was bothering him. So he said, "John, are you okay?" And John said, "I busted my tail for 36 years. Now, John retired as a 3-star general. And he said, "I busted my tail for 36 years. I did everything the Army asked of me. They rewarded me with promotions and command and some wonderful assignments. And along the way, my wife left me and my kids won't talk to me today." So if you think about it, he put all his focus on his career early in his life, and it came at a huge personal cost. And he may not have even realized he was doing that. I've got a story a little bit later that I'll tell to make this point even more significant. Here's Forrest Gump. Most of you have seen the movie, I'm sure. If you haven't, it's a wonderful movie. I encourage you to see it. This is him sitting on the bench. There's a woman sitting over to our left, his right, and he turns to her with a box of chocolates on his lap. He opens it, he picks one up, and he says, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And that's absolutely true. To use another metaphor, each of us have gotten to forks in the road in our life, personally and professionally, and circumstances have often taken us in a direction that we didn't expect. And at the time, we may have said to ourselves, this isn't supposed to be happening to me. Why am I going left when I should be going right? My goal is down that road to the right, yet circumstances are taking me in a different direction. That has happened to me personally and has happened to me professionally. And I've got a couple of stories to make that point. The first one is that when I was the professional story is that when I was a colonel, full colonel, just brand new full colonel, the Army told me I was going to command a base. And I didn't know much about commanding a base. I had been an armor officer my entire career. And I said, I don't know anything about running base. I don't care to learn. And they said, no, you're going to run a base. And I said, okay. And I went in there with some real trepidations. It turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me professionally. I learned more about myself. I learned more about leadership than I ever would have had I stayed in that traditional path that I just spent 20 years in. My workforce changed from an all-male soldier environment to a almost all civilian environment where 50% were women and 50% were German, because my base was in Germany. And up to that point, 99% of anybody who had reported to me were males, and they were soldiers. So I had to learn how to communicate and how to lead a very different demographic than I was used to. And quite frankly, it set me up for things that I didn't even know were in my future. And quite frankly, had I not had that experience, I'm not sure that I would have become a general. Chapter 18 of my book is called The Light at the End of the Tunnel. When I came out of Purdue University in 1973 and I went to Fort Hood, Texas, I married my college sweetheart. She was beautiful. She was wonderful. She was everything I could possibly imagine I wanted and could have. And I was so happy. And 2 years later, she left me. And I was absolutely devastated. And I didn't know how to deal with that. I was a tank battalion maintenance officer, which means that I was responsible for the maintenance of 58 tanks and about another 50 support vehicles. My office was in the motor pool, and where all these tanks were. And the way I dealt with this personal problem, rather than to go home and stare at 4 empty walls, was to go to work. And I just invested myself in work. And I found myself there on a Friday night at 7:30 when the brigade commander walked into the motor pool. Friday night at a 7:30. I didn't expect anybody, certainly not a leader who was about 5 levels above me. He commanded 4,000 soldiers. I was just one of them. He said, Lieutenant, let's go take a walk in the motor pool. And so we did. We walked up and down the tank line. And he didn't say a word about the maintenance of our tanks, the appearance of our tanks, or about anything about my personal problem. All he talked about were the challenges that he had faced in his life and how he had overcome them. And when we got back to the front gate, he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, there's light at the end of this tunnel. You just can't see it yet. Have a great weekend. And I said, thank you very much. And he left. And he took me out of the depths of despair and the depression that I was in. And he demonstrated to me that a leader cared about everybody in his organization. Somebody told him about the challenges that this young lieutenant was facing. I was about 23, 24 years old at the time. And he took time out of his schedule on a Friday night to come down, find me, and tell me that it was going to be okay. So what's the rest of that story? I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky about 4 months later, and about 3 months after I got to Fort Knox, I met Karen Lusk. And you saw photos of her earlier in the presentation. And she has been my bride for 44 years. We have 2 wonderful children. I have the finest grandchild on the planet. You saw a picture of him when he was about 1 or 2 earlier. And I cannot imagine life having turned out differently than it has. But I couldn't see that in 1976. Life was falling apart for me in 1976. And I didn't know there was light at the end of the tunnel, but there was. And for most of us that are going through these kinds of challenges in our life, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Lean on a friend to help you get through that. Persevere, be patient. And my experience has been that oftentimes it turns out just fine. There's a professor and he's standing at the front of his class, and he has a table in front of him. It's covered in a cloth. He reaches underneath it. He pulls out a big jar. He puts it on the table. Then he pulls out a basket of rocks and he starts putting it in the jar. Some of you, many of you may have heard this story before, but it'll make the point clear. And he turns to the class after he fills the jar and he says to the class, "Is the jar full?" And everybody says, "Yep, the jar is full." And so he reaches underneath the table and he brings out a bag of pebbles and he pours them into the jar. And the pebbles fall down among the rocks, hit the bottom, and then slowly fill up until it gets to the top. And he says, "Is the jar full?" And they all go, "Well, you fooled us the first time, but yeah, now the jar is full." So then he pulls out a pitcher of water and he pours the water into the jar. It goes down to the bottom. It fills the jar up to the top. And he says, "Is the jar full?" Now nobody really knows how to answer that because they've been fooled twice. And so they can't imagine what he might put in the jar. So they don't know how to answer that question. But he says, "I don't have anything else to put in the jar." But the moral of the story is the rocks represent what's most important in your life. Put the rocks in the jar first, because if you put the pebbles and the water in the jar, you're going to leave a rock out and you're going to regret it. The rocks represent what's most important in your life. Prioritize those and put them in your life first. So I think it's important to understand that as you reflect back on the story I told about the 3-star general, he probably left his family rock out of the jar, and he may not have even realized it when he was doing it, and now he was regretting it. So put the rocks in the jar first. Now, let's go back to the Hale Koa. It's now Christmas evening, 1999, and I'm staying almost in the same room that I was in many, many years before with my wife on our first visit to Hawaii. We are on vacation. I'm not assigned there, and we're celebrating the millennium turnover from 1999 to 2000. I have my parents with me, and at the time, I was the commander of an organization that actually ran that Army hotel. So I knew the general manager very, very well, and he was a good friend. He invited me and my family. I had 2 kids by this time. He invited me and my family to join them for Christmas dinner. And he had an apartment in the hotel. And we were at Christmas dinner, having dinner, when the phone rang. He picked up the phone. He said it was for me. And when I got on the phone, it was the Army Operations Center. And they told me that my sister had died. The Red Cross had just told them to find me and tell me that my sister had died the day before. So I hung up. I told our host about the phone call I had just received. I pulled my wife aside. I told her about the phone call. And I said, when dinner's over, I'd ask you to take our 2 kids up to the room. I'm going to walk out on the grounds of the Hale Koa and Fort Tarusi here, and with my parents, I'm going to find a quiet spot so I can tell them about the phone call that I've just received. So after dinner, we did that. We said our goodbyes, and I took my parents out. We found a big banyan tree with a picnic table, and I sat my parents down on the picnic table, and I told them that they had just lost their only daughter. We didn't know the circumstances of her death at the time. My mother fell off the bench onto the ground and shaking uncontrollably. My dad sat there on the bench, stunned, and just stared off into space. It was devastating news to get on Christmas night, as you can imagine. We later learned that she took her own life. My sister had a very difficult life, and she took her own life. And in the suicide note that she left, she wrote, "I cannot see the light at the tunnel anymore." That's an actual quotation, which very eerily is similar to what Colonel Woodmansey said to me in the motor pool in 1976. He told me there was light at the end of the tunnel, and I just couldn't see it yet. But on December 23rd, when this note was written, that's what she put in her note. Now, this is a photograph of my sister a couple of years before that with her 14-year-old son, Jason. Jason is like a second son to me now. Since my sister's death, I kind of took him under our wing, and he's a wonderful, wonderful person. And what you see now on the right-hand side is Jason at the Commandant of the Marine Corps' house with his wife, his 2 kids, as a chief warrant officer. I retired Jason on the deck of the USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor in August of 2019 after 20 years of wonderful service, one of the most respected Marines in his career field. He built a house in North Carolina on the ocean. He's been very successful second career, very, very happy. And as I reflect back on the loss of my sister, I have to ask myself, you know, if she would have known how her middle son would have turned out, and that she would now have 7 grandchildren, all of which are wonderful, would she have taken her life on Christmas Eve of 1999? And I don't know the answer to that question. So in 2003, I told the Army, look, I have figured out what rocks are important to me. I didn't put it in those terms, but I had, because I was reflecting on my sister's loss. And I said to myself, you know, I've got a daughter who's about 14 years old now. She wasn't experiencing any of the issues that my sister had, the difficulties that my sister had, but I wanted to make sure I gave her every opportunity for success. So I told the Army, I want to retire when I hit 30 years service and go to the next chapter of my life so I can reprioritize what's important. And I did. I went to Florida. We went to Celebration, as you learned earlier. My daughter went to Celebration High School for 2 years. She commuted to the University of Central Florida in Orlando for another 4 years. She graduated cum laude. She turned a part-time gig at Disney World into a full-time job, has advanced in her career. She's now a lighting designer for Disney World. She's happily married. She owns her own home. She travels all over the world. She's more active than I can possibly imagine. She is very, very happy. And I give 95+% of the credit to her. And I give a couple of percent credit to me reprioritizing my life at that time after my sister's suicide to make sure I gave my daughter every opportunity for success in the next chapter of her life. This is her at St. Augustine on the beach when she got married. And I understood at that time what rocks to put in my jar. Here's some final thoughts that I've kind of borrowed from others. And what you will see is the thought, some of which are tongue twisters, and then what it means in red. The first one is your talk talks and your walk talks, but your walk talks louder than your talk talks. And that is a tongue twister. But if you dissect that and you think about it, what it really means is lead by example. John Maxwell is one of the leading leadership gurus in America and in the world today, and that's what he said. An optimist is wrong as often as a pessimist, but the optimist has a lot more fun. I will tell you that optimism is contagious in your organization, but so is pessimism. Be positive. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Show loyalty down the chain as well as up the chain. When you show your organization how much you care about them, think about Colonel Woodensee in 1976 in a motor pool. What you get back in return will be multiplied. It will be compounded. People will sit up and take notice of you if you will sit up and take notice of what makes them sit up and take notice. That's another tongue twister, but when you dissect that, it simply means care. If you are hearing with the intent to reply, you are not listening. Good listening is an art. I talked about that earlier when we were talking about communications. When you see the other person starting to talk in the middle of your, when you're talking to them and leaning forward and they're moving, their body's moving, their body language is pretty clear. They just can't wait for you to stop so they can start talking. They're not listening very well. So make sure that when you're listening to somebody else, you're clearly focused on what they have to say. Good listening is, in fact, an art. And finally, if I have been able to see further than others, it's because I stood on the shoulder of giants. That was said by Sir Isaac Newton, and that means show humility. Some of you have seen this photo. It circulated around the press and around the world in 2005. This is Gunnery Sergeant Michael Berghardt. He was a leader of an explosive ordnance detachment team. They were responsible for finding what we called IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which was the most popular weapon of choice by terrorists in Iraq during that time period. This photograph was taken in Ramadi right after 3 soldiers had been killed and Gunnery Sergeant Berghardt had been blown up but not killed by an IED. And the person who activated that IED did it about 1 kilometer away using a phone device to actually activate the IED. Gunnery Sergeant Berghardt insisted on walking to the vehicle that was going to take him away. And then you see this middle finger salute that he is sending, an act of defiance to the terrorist who tried to blow him up. Now, many people think that's the moral of this story, but it's not, because I know people who know Gunnery Sergeant Berghardt. And one of the things he was trying to convey to his Marines and to the soldiers that were with him that day was the confidence of a leader, because he knew that as he was medevac to rear to get medically treated, they would be out there the next day looking for IEDs. In Ramadi in 2005, there were 1,000 IEDs exploded and another 1,000 that were discovered before they exploded in 1 year's time. It was a very difficult time. But that's an example of a leader that's showing confidence to his subordinates, because again, he knew that they would be out there the next day. Let me finish this by telling you a fictitious story. Many of you know this story if you saw the movie Saving Private Ryan. This is Captain John Miller on the left, and that's Private James Patrick Ryan on the right. Miller's played by Tom Hanks, and Ryan is played by Matt Damon. The story is about 4 soldiers that go off to war. 3 of them are killed in combat, and the news of the death is brought to the mother in one visit. The Chief of Staff of the Army is determined to make sure this mother doesn't lose her 4th son. So he tells the Army, go find Private Ryan and bring him home. Captain Miller gets that mission, and with about 9 or 10 other soldiers, he goes behind enemy lines to go find Private Ryan to bring him home. And along the way, he loses a couple of his soldiers. They're killed. When he finally finds Private Ryan, and this is the scene in which he tells him about the loss of his 3 brothers, he says, my orders are to bring you home. Ryan says, I can't leave. And Miller says, what are we supposed to tell your mother? Ryan says, tell her I was here. Tell her I'm with the only brothers I have left. There's no way I'm going to leave this bridge. If you've seen the movie, you know that Captain Miller dies on that bridge. But just before he dies, he whispers into Ryan's ear, earn this, earn it. And what he meant was, don't let the service and the sacrifice of me and my men go without purpose. Lead a purposeful life. The movie then flashes forward about 50 years, and we find Private Ryan, now an old man, standing over Captain Miller's Normandy grave with tears in his eyes. He stands, he salutes the grave, he turns to his wife and he says, tell me I've led a good life. Tell me I'm a good man. Ryan remembered the words that Miller whispered into his ear about leading a purposeful life, leading a meaningful life, so that the sacrifices to keep him alive didn't go in vain. There are thousands of Private Ryans in today's military. There are millions of Private Ryans in America, people who are leading a purposeful life. Reflect on your own and determine whether or not you are as well. That's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. We have about 20 minutes, I think. This is how you find me on the internet. That's my website at the top. That's my email and my phone number. I'm also happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn. So, yeah. I'll turn it back to Tammy.
Do we have any questions for Craig? Other than everyone thinks your presentation was great.
Well, thank you.
No questions? Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any questions. Craig, thank you again for presenting at the Oregon chapter. Really appreciate it. Great presentation. For all of our attendees, please don't forget to fill out the survey that we put in the chat. Our next session begins at 1, and a special thank you to APREV again for sponsoring this event. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, everybody, for what you do.
Thank you.